So Ready Set is a DEI culture and management consulting firm. We try to use rigorous and data-backed approaches to really help organizations meet their emergent challenges, particularly as they relate to people. So those could be internal, like employee needs, employee activism, et cetera. And it can be external, like their communication strategy, how they engage stakeholders. Our clients range from, tech companies, that's kind of where we started. That was their sweet spot for a while, to Fortune 500s, entertainment organizations, and even government bodies, particularly at the state and local level.
All right, well, thank you for that snapshot. Now, so given the recent well-publicized setbacks, how do you envision the evolution of DEI to address the challenges that organizations are facing? And the other thing is, have you seen this before? Things go in historical cycles.
Yeah, I'll answer the second question first, and maybe ask you to ask the first question again. Yes, we've seen this before. The sort of pattern of progression and backlash. I have written about it a little bit in my book, How to Talk to Your Boss About Race. But, this has been happening since the Civil War, right? We had the Civil War, we had Reconstruction, then we had the backlash to Jim Crow. We had the end of Jim Crow and affirmative action, and then we had the backlash to affirmative action starting in the Reagan years with some of those policies, right? And then what we're seeing now is we had sort of the resurgence with the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, even, thinking about accessibility with, COVID policies. And now we're seeing backsliding in all of those areas. So I always tell people, not to be surprised when that happens. We tend to think of progress as a sort of linear advancement, when in reality, it's more of a push-pull, and we have to, be prepared for that resistance. And could you ask the first part of your question again?
Well, it's the forward-looking part. I mean, how do you envision DEI to evolve now to effectively address this backlash or this historic sort of regression?
Well, I always suggest that people look at the problems first. DEI is a toolkit, right? It's a function in an organization meant to address specific, deeply entrenched problems, and it's evolving. So I think that a lot of the mechanisms that we've tried early on, some of them have worked, some of them haven't. And I think it's important that we learn from those. But, when we think about the future of DEI, as I said, focusing on the problem first, I think what's most important, right? So let's just specifically name some of these issues that organizations are going to have to deal with, no matter what happens in the DEI space, right? I think first is, you just had a panel on talent, right? The idea that we're not very good at identifying talent still, right? And we're not very equitable when we do that. So thinking through, how do we make our talent attraction, interviewing, and hiring processes more accurate, more equitable, I think is really important. In the sort of pushback to DEI, you hear a lot of conversations about meritocracy. But we have to be honest, the meritocracy has never existed when it comes to working in a company. Most people come into organizations through things like referrals, right? And most people's networks are really homogenous. So, even if we were to strip away traditional DEI programs, we would not revert back to a meritocracy. We would more deeply entrench those hiring problems that were already there and have less tools to solve them. So that's one thing. The other thing, that organizations still struggle with is how to promote equitably, how to recognize talent and nurture talent inside of the organization, no matter where it comes from. We need to get better at doing that. And then, to your point, there are these emergent challenges that may not neatly fall into what we think of when we think of DEI, but when we also think about what part of an organization is going to help solve them, it kind of falls under the DEI umbrella. DEI is the one part of the organization with the tools to deal with these problems, a lot of which still relate to aspects of our identity. So, for example, thinking through social and political polarization. We're in an election year. People are going to talk about the election. Election candidates are weaponizing questions of identity, things like immigration, ethnic backgrounds, et cetera, and deploying that really divisive rhetoric. And that seeps into the workplace. Moreover, you have problems of misinformation and radicalization of people online. So a lot of people who are bringing in these political conversations are also
Mhm.
bringing in talking points that may not be true or accurate or are intentionally inflammatory. So you have that. We're
Yeah.
still dealing with COVID and the impact of COVID on the workforce. And I know a lot of people are so ready to move on, myself included. I would love nothing more than to go back to normal.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing across not just the American economy, but European economies, Germany as well, is lost productivity due to chronic illness,
Right.
increasing disability. I know you all were just having a panel talking about
Mhm.
neurodiversity. We are seeing impacts of COVID on things like cognition, people struggling with brain fog, et cetera. That's not going to change. And so there are real questions about accessibility in the workplace and how we make our workplaces safe. Those are just a few emergent issues that we're tackling. I think one final one I'll say, and then I'll hand it back to you, that you mentioned is also growing consumer activism on both
Mm.
sides, right? So
Yeah.
if you think through the conservative boycotts, and there's actually more nuance to read, I think, of Target and Budweiser, and they
Yeah.
alienated both
Yes.
their liberal and conservative consumers by not really committing to anything. But you look at the impact of those boycotts, and then you look at the impact of boycotts on companies like McDonald's and Starbucks, which their fourth quarter numbers were really, really terrible. They posted significant losses in the billions.
Mhm.
Those are not going to go away either, and quite often those boycotts happen in response to companies taking certain social and political stances that have to do with identity. So in the instance of Budweiser and Target, it was their LGBTQ stance. In the instance of McDonald's and Starbucks, it was their stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict, right?
Mhm.
However you fall on those spectrums, whatever your beliefs, those are real factors in terms of how we do business, how we engage our
Right.
consumers, and people are finding their power. Consumers are finding their power and they're leveraging it.
In mentioning the Bud Light Target situation, there's a story in New Harvard Biz Review that contrasts what they did, which was not really standing behind their original
Mhm.
position, and then getting a backlash from both sides, with a Brazilian company that did almost the same thing as Bud Light did in terms of transgender issues, but they stuck with their position and they came out fine. They didn't get the backlash from the other side, and then the show moved on to other controversies, and they didn't suffer that
Yeah.
multi-hundred million dollar backlash from being wishy-washy. Um, so now we're hearing so much about the pushback against DEI, but you might maintain that companies' efforts are insufficient still, and that they really need to be doing more. So how against do they push
Yeah.
harder or in different ways?
Well, I think the pushback against DEI is interesting because in a lot of ways we're also starting to see what's behind it. I think
Mhm.
earlier this year and last year there were some arguments that could have been interpreted in good faith. We don't want to
Mhm.
bias the system in favor of one group. We really want a meritocracy, et cetera. What we're seeing now, particularly with some of the loudest voices that are anti-DEI voices, is really some sort of discrimination and bigotry that are behind those stances. So thinking about Rufo, who's been championing this and leading some of these lawsuits, and then looking at his ties with eugenics and race science magazines. Thinking about Bill Ackman, who's also been championing this stuff, and then seeing what happens when
Mhm.
the plagiarism hits home, and these accusations. And then the New York
Yeah.
Times just had a brilliant article looking at how it has been a coordinated effort, right? And we're seeing the fruits of that labor in states like Texas and Florida. I'm a Texan, so I'm deeply affected by that in terms of people now asking, having to sign permission slips to attend a lesson on a book by a Black author, books about children of different identities being banned for no particular reason. We're seeing sort of what's on the other side of this pushback, and it's pretty scary. So I do think that there's
Yeah.
been some recalibration in response to that. And yes, to your point, would I say DEI doesn't go far enough? I think that's one way to put it. I would say DEI needs to change, right? I think
Mm.
that we
Mhm.
have to again focus on the problem, right? I wrote in a recent piece that like, a Heritage Month is not going to address the deep underlying systemic issues that I just outlined earlier here, right? Like, I think we have to think through what we really need to do to solve these organizational issues, what businesses and other organizations need to do to like further the outcomes they want and the impact they want in the world. How do we build resilient organizations for the 21st century? And in a time where people are more diverse, the challenges that we're facing are more encompassing, it's more polarized, organizations too have to adapt. And I think my argument is that the tools that are going to be most useful for that adaptation come from the DEI toolkit, right?
Mhm.
So yes and no.
Well, you mentioned the legal front, and
Yeah.
it's sort of centralized, but in many atomized kind of like legal cases and reverse
Yeah.
discrimination things. And now, do you think that DEI starts having a component of compliance too, or working together with legal so that what you still make the effort, but you don't get all timid about it because you kind of a company can understand what is the risk.
Yeah.
How do you advise about that?
Yeah. Well, I think in some ways DEI has always been based in compliance. In fact, when I first started my business, that was a tension because compliance-based approaches to DEI are less effective than other approaches. But when we think about EEOC reporting, when we think about affirmative action, those historical sort of things that
Mhm,
align with what DEI does today, those were, based on
mhm,
legal compliance. So in some ways, we may be returning back to that. It is harder because it's less clear, what is going to be legally compliant. Even if we look at the Supreme Court's race-based affirmative
mhm,
action ruling for universities,
mhm.
it's interesting to note that it was only about race,
Yeah.
right? So, there's a real question about gender, disability, et cetera, that still has not been answered. I think companies are getting more savvy about how they label their DEI initiatives, how they think about targeting those initiatives. I think that's going to continue. But I also think that, with this present Supreme
Mhm.
Court, how politicized it all is, legal compliance is a moving target because legal compliance is a little bit more, the legal arena is a little bit more volatile and political than it has been in the
Yeah.
past. The final piece I'll say though is all of this being said, organizations, whether they're in the public sector or private sector, are doing more of a balanced risk calculus. So yes, there is the risk
Mhm.
of a reverse discrimination lawsuit, and it is unclear how meritorious that lawsuit would be, particularly at the Supreme Court level. But there's still a risk of like your just straightforward discrimination lawsuits. Racial discrimination payouts have been increasing
Yeah.
over time, so we know like that's still going to be a thing. But also things like age discrimination, which is a very fast growing segment of discrimination lawsuits. So companies have to really figure out how they want to balance that risk, and in some ways they're really walking a tightrope.
Mhm, mhm. Um, Here's another question, about what companies are like doing right now, in the face of the pushback. And some are embracing more inclusive terms or sort of playing with the language a bit, like and talking about belonging, which is of course hard to argue against that. And then some are reframing programs to focus less on specific identities, such as a fellowship for people of color. And then in talking more about lived experience to broaden things a bit. How do you how would you advise employers to on both those fronts, the sort of relabeling and then slightly changing the lens?
Yeah, I think the relabeling is helpful. I think language is a moving target,
Mhm.
and where language becomes less useful, I think we should adapt, right? But I think that we have to be careful. Like we have to
Yeah.
call things what they are. If there's I think I
Yeah.
think language like belonging, inclusion, accessibility, all of that is great. And I think that's fine. I think where I get nervous is when companies steer clear of naming some of the very foundational issues that they're trying to solve because it makes it harder for them to do so.
Yeah.
So racism still exists, right? Right. It's just a problem that companies have to solve. Religious bias is becoming so much more of an issue, particularly now that companies need the right language so they can bring in the right expertise to solve, right? I think there's still, so it is tricky, right? Because if you name racism and if you name religious bias or whatever, you then have to figure out, how do I solve those problems without creating a perception that I'm being unfair to other groups? And I think that's a challenge. I do warn companies, again, stay focused on the problem. So yes, I think there's a lot of legal pressure to refrain from targeting one specific group because of allegations of reverse racism. So, looking at the lawsuit of Fearless Fund, looking at some of these other issues where programs specifically targeting, law firms have dealt with this as well, Black people, Black and brown people have come under fire. I think we can speak to, however, marginalization and bias, which are, at the end of the day, are the problems we're trying to actually solve, right? And so, if you come from a group that has historically been marginalized, that can be socially, ethnically, demographically, it's a way to reframe what you're doing when you're still doing what is, in essence, a need-based calculation to make the system more equitable and more of a meritocracy, to the extent that that's actually possible.
Now, how can companies, as they adjust and recalibrate, make sure that they're not just engaging in like performative activities, but genuinely working DEI into the core strategies and operations of their organizations?
Yeah. I think it's this question is more important now than ever, because everybody
Yeah.
is more savvy than they were 4 years ago, right? So 4 years ago, you put a black square on your Instagram and people were like deeply moved. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, yay, like this company loves me. But even then, we were starting to see these sort of rumblings around what real commitment looks like. I think, my answer is going to be different depending on what sector a company sits in and whether we're talking about a company, a private organization, or a public one. But I think in all cases, it's really important to understand what problems is the lack of DEI, human-centric approaches causing in your organization, right? Is it a cultural issue? Is it a merit issue? Is it who is that affecting? And then how is that impacting what you want to do for your business, right? I think going back to the boycott example, where Target and Budweiser lost their way. Yeah, I mean, part of it was like the constituencies they were talking to, but part of it was like they were unclear about what this meant for their business. Were they trying to tap into a new market? Like, right? Was that better than where they were currently? Were they trying to rebrand as something else? Were they trying to, and so it made it easy for them to waffle, right? Because it wasn't tied to a specific business metric or business outcome. And I think it's really important that companies, when they do this work, it's one thing to say holistic, but when you actually put it into practice, to think through what are the business outcomes that we want to have as a result of this approach. Do we want to have a more diverse workforce, one that understands our customers in a different way? Do we want to bring a new voice, a new vision to our product? Do we want to make sure that we're tapping into the right talent pools and that people are getting promoted for their hard work? Do we want to increase retention? Are we seeing like high turnover costs? Are people posting things on Glassdoor saying that we're really toxic? Are we losing consumers in certain growing different demographics because we can't reach them? Are we still relevant? Like, these are all questions like companies can ask themselves that will inform their approaches to DEI. And one final thing I'll say about that is, at Ready Set, we've started to really deepen our communications work, right? We're now doing strategic communications, executive communications, crisis management, branding, in part because it's not just about what you do, it's about how you talk about what you do and having the right language. Going back to that boycott example again, I really think that that's where they also got it wrong, right? Like, they didn't really know what the
Mhm.
message was. They didn't know how to frame it. They didn't know who their audience was. They didn't know what the objective was, right? And even if you look internally at some of the consternation around DEI and the baggage it has, a lot of that's because we don't really talk about our work well. People are still, this language is still new to people, right? Like, 3 or 4 years ago, we weren't saying our pronouns, right? Like, we weren't talking about things like race in the workplace. Like, this is all really, really new. And leaders,
Mhm.
managers, employees, we're all grappling with how do we talk about these initiatives in a way where people feel included and understand the holistic benefit to them and not excluded or tokenized or further marginalized, right? Like, because we're seeing that on all sides, right? If you're from an underrepresented group, you're like, am I the token? If you're from a group that is a majority group, you're like, this is not for me, right? And we need to get better about talking about how these initiatives relate to everyone.
Mhm. It seems also, doesn't it seem as if you have to be sort of consistent, like build your reputation over time and be steady? Like,
Mm-hmm.
some company like Patagonia, Ben and Jerry's, and certain other companies might have a reputation. You know where they're coming from, and you're not startled. Whereas Bud Light jumped in and then kind of backed away, like,
Yeah.
whoa. Um, so it also seems like, in terms of knowing about all those impacts and stakeholders, we probably need new research and metrics. Don't companies need that? Because certain things like, something like quotas is a dirty word now. It's just not what you're going to do. So it seems
Mm-hmm.
like there need to be more creation of new kinds of metrics and measurements so you can see what success looks like.
Yeah, I think some of those I think some of those are there. Like that's the good news, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the first thing is, again, deciding what your business case is, what your goal is, right? So if
Mhm.
your goal, I'm just going to use an example. This is IBM did this years ago.
Oh,
But basically they were like, we need to change our culture. Like we're a bunch of like, it's old, it's staid, it's people in button downs selling stuff with in khakis. It's not. And then we need to reach new target demographics, right? Like we're now seeing growing consumer base in Black and brown communities. Da, 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 da. Like who are we bringing in from those communities
mhm,
that speaks that language? And then, what are we doing culturally? And so I use that example because there are ways that you can measure that, right? Like if
mhm,
you know what your consumer base currently looks like, and you know what you want your target consumer base to look like, you can measure the impact of your DEI initiatives in that way over time, right? That's not an identity quota, right? That's not like we need X amount of Black people to get to this target market, but it is like you will be held accountable for sales in this target market, and hiring somebody from that market might help you get there, right? Like
mhm,
it's rooted in something. I think if you look at culture, there's been so much amazing work around metrics which indicate healthy cultures and toxic cultures. And regardless of identity, quite often where you see a discrimination or sexism or ageism, you're also seeing other elements of toxicity in a culture. So you
mhm.
can measure perceptions of trust. You can measure perceptions of transparency. You can
Yeah.
measure perceptions of growth. You can cut those perceptions across demographics as well and see who is experiencing your organization in different ways. I think the key is not to, wait on the new research and the new metrics, but to really think about which metrics tie closely to your business and take, like you're saying, an
Mhm.
intentional approach to that.
Okay, I have one more question, and we have one more minute, and
Okay.
that is like all these acute problems that make headlines: the war in the Middle East, Bud Light, and so on. What they command our attention, but what are we not looking at? What's kind of what are we going to be blindsided by, or what long term things should we be paying more attention to?
Yeah. So I think, I'm going to go back to COVID and
Hmm.
disability. I think one of the reasons why we are not paying as close attention to it, and you'll notice like in every conversation I have, I talk about it because I, as a founder, am seeing the effects in my own company and I'm seeing the effects in my clients. What happens when employees are sick more often, when they have more chronic illness? I experienced this myself, right? So when I got my second COVID infection, after that, almost immediately afterwards, I was diagnosed with lupus. And I learned that that's been like that is associated with COVID infections. Sometimes
Mhm.
COVID infections can trigger lupus. I'm not the only person I know this has happened to. We don't talk about that.
Wow.
We don't talk about we're so used to covering up disability to begin with and chronic illness to begin with. When it
Mhm.
happens to us, we don't talk about it. And there was a research study done in Germany that shows that due to COVID and chronic illness, the German workforce, I think, lost like 20 something days of productivity. And
Wow.
so we're seeing it. We're seeing people who are sick more often, whose immune systems are weaker. We're seeing more instances of chronic illness. We're seeing more instances of disability, some of which is invisible, some of which is very visible.
Mhm.
Employees, even if they're just for a short time dealing with it or dealing with brain fog and all of that stuff that comes with it. And I just think that companies are in denial. And I understand why. Like it's really
Yeah.
hard for me as a founder to think through, okay, what do I do? Right? Like what do I do? I have these people who
Yeah.
have the needs of my business have changed dramatically from 2019 to 2024.
Yeah.
It's not even the same.
Yeah.
It's not remotely the same. But if we're living our values, if I as a founder am living my values, I have to now meet the needs of this team that's been with me for years, whose lives are changing,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And I'm
Yeah.
not the only person who's dealing with it. And I think traditionally our tools that we're relying on are old school tools. They're like back to
Yeah.
normal, back in the office, you got your sick days, you're going to be okay. And we're not going to get political with this and we're just going to follow. And I think what we're seeing is that over time is not going to serve
Mhm.
us. I think we're going to see more labor shortages. I think we're going to see more attrition in the office. I think we're going to see lower productivity, and I think that's going to have a real impact on our bottom lines, like on business.
Yeah.
Period. Whether we want to deal with it or not. So I think the best thing that companies can do now is really critically think about accessibility and
Mhm.
disability inclusion and how they're going to make those accommodations for their workforce.
Well, Yvonne, thank you so much. I'm sorry to hear what you've gone through, but it was generous of you to share and tell people. Just being more open, I think, just helps the world,
Mhm.
helps everybody's well-being. So thanks again for being here, Yvonne, and hope to see you back before long.
Thank you so much for having me, and just thank you for this great conversation.